They didn't panic all at once. That is the first mistake people make when they imagine collapse. They imagine shouting, running, chaos. But that's not how it began. It began with waiting. People stood quietly outside banks that never opened. They read newspapers that contradicted yesterday's certainty. They listened to radios hoping someone, somewhere, still knew what was happening. And when confidence finally disappeared, the collapse didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like silence. In every age, value is more than numbers. It is a mirror of the human soul. This episode is not about money. It is about belief. Because ask yourself this: why does effort feel pointless when the future feels uncertain? Markets do not collapse when resources vanish. They collapse when people stop believing that tomorrow will be better than today. And in the early 1930s, that belief quietly died. The world had just survived a catastrophe. The Great War had shattered empires, borders, and illusions. Millions were gone. Entire generations were scarred. Yet, against all odds, the 1920s promised renewal. Factories expanded, electric lights spread across cities, automobiles replaced horses. Stock prices climbed higher than anyone thought possible. Progress felt unstoppable. People believed history had finally learned its lesson. But here's the dangerous part of optimism. What happens when confidence outpaces reality? Then, almost without warning, the illusion cracked. In 1929, markets began to fall. At first, it felt familiar. Corrections had happened before. Panics had come and gone. So people waited. Because waiting had worked before. But this time was different. The fall didn't bounce back. It deepened. Week after week, wealth evaporated. Savings that represented entire lifetimes disappeared in days. And here is a question few asked at the time. What if this wasn't a temporary shock? What if it was a psychological one? By 1931, the crisis was no longer financial. It was social. Bread lines stretched across city blocks. Men who once wore suits now waited silently for soup. Children learned hunger before they learned hope. The tragedy was not just poverty, it was uncertainty. Because poverty hurts the body, uncertainty breaks the mind. Economists had answers, clear ones, confident ones. They insisted the system would correct itself. Wages would fall, prices would adjust, patience would restore balance. And on paper, it made sense. But here is the question no model could answer. How long can people wait when they are afraid? Patience requires faith, and faith was vanishing. Business owners did not invest, not because it was irrational, but because the future felt unreadable. Consumers did not spend, not because they were ignorant, but because survival demanded restraint. Everyone waited. Factories waited for customers. Workers waited for jobs. Governments waited for signs of recovery. And when everyone waits, nothing moves. This is the paradox worth pausing on. What if the most rational choice for each person creates the worst possible outcome for everyone? Every decision made sense in isolation. Together, they produced disaster. One man watched this with growing unease. He did not see a mechanical failure. He saw a psychological one. Interest rates fell, yet investment refused to return. Wages declined, yet unemployment remained. Prices stabilized, yet confidence did not follow. So ask yourself, if the rules were working, why wasn't reality responding? Fear was guiding behavior. Fear of losing what little remained. Fear of betting on a future that felt unreliable. Fear that no calculation could guarantee safety. Fear spread quietly. A factory owner delayed expansion. That delay meant fewer jobs. Those without jobs spent less. Lower spending confirmed the factory owner's fear. A loop formed. Self-reinforcing, self-destructive, and here is the disturbing insight. No one inside the loop feels responsible for the collapse. Classical economics assumed rational actors and stable expectations. But what if expectations themselves were unstable? What if people were not responding to prices, but to stories about the future? Because humans do not act on numbers alone, they act on narratives. And the dominant narrative had turned dark. Across nations, governments hesitated. Intervention felt dangerous. Inaction felt cruel. Old rules offered clarity, but no relief. New ideas felt risky, even heretical. And this raised a moral question no society wants to face. Is doing nothing really neutral? Unemployment did more than destroy income. It destroyed dignity. Men who had obeyed every rule were suddenly excess. Hard work no longer guaranteed survival. Merit no longer protected anyone. So the silent question spread. If the system no longer rewards responsibility, why remain responsible? The moral contract of society was breaking. This was not a shortage of resources, not a technological collapse. It was a collapse of collective confidence. Entire societies became uncertain at once. The future stopped pulling people forward. And when the future disappears, the present contracts. People stop building, stop risking, stop imagining. They retreat. Belief, once broken, does not return easily. People stopped planning weddings, postponed children, delayed repairing homes, not because they lacked money, but because they lacked certainty. So ask yourself, how many decisions in your own life depend on believing that tomorrow will make sense? Trust between strangers weakened. A handshake lost its power. A promise felt fragile. People retreated inward. Families relied only on themselves. Communities grew quiet. And with that retreat came danger. Because when belief in shared recovery disappears, shared responsibility soon follows. What made this moment unprecedented was not suffering alone. It was synchronized fear. Everyone hesitated together. And without a reference point, waiting became endless. This is the blind spot the old language could not see. People were not refusing to act because incentives were wrong. They were refusing to act because the future felt hostile. Risk felt existential. Hope felt dangerous. Fear became rational. And this is where everything changes. Because if fear is rational, then waiting is no longer safe. If belief has collapsed, then belief must be rebuilt. Not by words, but by visible action. Action that interrupts fear. Action that makes the future feel real again. This was the world standing at a threshold, between waiting and acting, between faith and paralysis. The question was no longer economic, it was moral. Confidence is invisible. You only notice it when it disappears. In the next episode, we explore the idea that emerged from this silence, the realization that economies are driven not just by incentives, but by fragile human expectations. So ask yourself before we continue, what would you do if waiting felt more dangerous than acting? And who, if anyone, should move first when everyone is afraid? This is the story of confidence, and the moment it died.